Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. The United States, with partners France and the United Kingdom, launched missile strikes on Syria in retaliation for an alleged chemical weapons attack on civilians by Syrian President Bashar Assad. During his address to the nation last night, President Trump promised that this might not be the last military action in Syria.
We are prepared to sustain this response until the Syrian regime stops its use of prohibited chemical agents.
But Trump's own Secretary of Defense seemed to offer a different view.
Right now, this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
Retired Navy Admiral Robert Natter served as commander of both the U.S. Atlantic Fleet and the 7th Fleet in Asia. He joins me now from Washington. Admiral, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Paul.
On the terms that the Secretary of Defense set out, and General Dunford set out militarily, was this strike a military success?
Oh, I think so. Certainly it had limited objectives. Those objectives were hit and most likely totally destroyed. It does send a very clear signal to the Syrian leadership that the civilized world is not going to put up with this.
Okay, but on that question of deterrent, and you heard both the president and the secretary use that word, deter, we did that a year ago. And here we had, in the interim, a very effective strike then. And since then, we've had the Syrians use chemical weapons many, many times. Why is this strike going to be more of a deterrent than that one?
Well, this strike was about double the number of missiles, and I would say the targets were much better targets than the last strike. And it's already been stated by our leadership that if this happens again, then this will be accelerated and there will be other targets hit. I don't think there's any doubt that that's the case. And certainly with our allies involved, it's very believable.
Okay, so these targets were better because these were the actual chemical sites as opposed to production and delivery sites as opposed to an air base the last time. Is that the point?
That is the point, and I'm sure there are other targets that would be more strategic and would be much more painful for the Syrians.
Okay, now the Russians, of course, condemned the attack, denied that Syria had been responsible for chemical attacks. But were you surprised that they laid back as they have? They didn't apparently take really active measures to try to stop the missiles or take any military response.
Well, look, I'm convinced the Russians aren't excited about getting into a military engagement with the United States. That would be catastrophic for them. It would certainly be very painful for us. They have limited objectives in Syria, and they're not ready to go to total war with us over those limited objectives. I think that's obvious.
So how effective, though, are the Russian missile defenses and radars in Syria? Because they've been delivering a lot more of those in the last couple of years. Is that something that militarily if we went in there in any force in a future attack, say, particularly with fighters, we'd have to disable those, I assume, or we could be in trouble?
Well, again, it depends on if they attempt to engage our assets that are going in there. Certainly, we have the right of self-defense. The Russians know that. The Russians were advised in advance and coordinated the airspace for this. And so, again, limited objectives on our part and limited response on the Russians' part. Okay. I think that's appropriate.
Okay, going forward, do you see a strategy here, a larger strategy by the administration going forward in Syria, and what our role there is going to be in the days ahead?
Well, I think they're certainly focused on Syria. Their concern is obviously the sustainment of a leader that is stooping to use outlawed weapons of mass destruction against innocent civilians. It's more complicated by the fact that the Iranians are there, the Russians are there, the Turks have different objectives than we do there. So this is, to say the least, a quagmire. And I think that our approach to this, because it is in our self-interest to have our interests protected there is appropriate.
But the president said, he's been saying before this the chemical attack, look, I want to get out of there, and we're going to get out soon. Now, if that happens, what would that mean, do you think, on the ground in Syria, and what message does that send to Russia or Iran, which obviously have longer-term designs on Syria?
Well, our presence there has resulted in some very good operational successes on the part of the people and forces that we're supporting. Getting out of there is a term that needs some more definition, I think.
It depends on what you mean by getting out. We could, but let me ask you this specifically. You remember when we set up, first President Bush set up a safe zone in northern Iraq that was very effective. It didn't threaten Saddam Hussein's role, but it did protect the Kurds. Do you think we could do that militarily in parts of Syria?
I think that would be possible with the cooperation of the Turks and with at least the conversation with the Russians. The last thing, though, we need to try and do is establish a safe zone where there's current conflict and where there are differing interests and arguments over who should control that safe zone.
Okay, you think we'd have to have the cooperation of the Russians?
I think at least the acknowledgement on their part that such a zone would be in the benefit of the situation in Syria.
Okay, yeah. Admiral Natter, thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
UN Ambassador Nikki Haley warning the world that America is locked and loaded and ready to respond if Syria uses chemical weapons again. Our panel's take on how Russia will react and what it means for the future in Syria. Next.
With yesterday's military action, our message was crystal clear. The United States of America will not allow the Assad regime to continue to use chemical weapons. Last night, we obliterated the major research facility that it used to assemble weapons of mass murder. I spoke to the president this morning, and he said if the Syrian regime uses this poisonous gas again, the United States is locked and loaded.
That was U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley announcing the United States' intention to the UN Security Council in response to the use of chemical weapons by Bashar Assad, just as tensions with fellow Security Council member and Assad ally Russia are increasing. So how will Russia and Iran respond to the Allied action? And does the Trump administration have a larger strategy for Syria? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial board member Mary Kissel, and columnist Bill McGurn. So let's start with just the basic first question. Was the strike appropriate and necessary?
Yeah, I think we could conclude that, Paul. It most certainly was necessary. It was a chemical attack. It was a god-awful chemical attack. Chemical weapons have been abhorred since World War I. We have conventions against it, and it was necessary to hit those three sites. But what we have to understand is the administration, I think, has made crystal clear. At this point in time, the pretext for this was only the chemical weapon attack, not anything else that has been going on in Syria in the civil war or the adjacent regions.
Okay, but is that by itself enough to justify such an action? Are chemical weapons that are so abhorrent and such a violation of norms that it's worth this kind of one-time attack?
Yes, I think it is. They are that abhorrent. And I think what the president has said, if they use chemical weapons again, Assad runs the risk of another attack by the United States. I don't mean in the larger sense of the strategy in the region that may have been sufficient, but they did put down a marker on chemical weapons.
Of course, it's basically saying if you use a particular kind of method to kill people, chemicals, you will pay a price. But if you use barrel bombs or saturation bombing, you won't.
No, that's right, Paul. And the administration made very clear last night in a series of statements that this is not about the Civil War. It is only about enforcing that norm against chemical weapons.
Will it work as a deterrent, do you think?
I don't think so, Paul, because, look, if President Trump is so concerned about stopping the use of chemical weapons, he's also in the same breath acknowledging that Assad might use them again, suggesting that he still has them. If he really cares so much about the CWC, that arms control treaty, then we should have gotten rid of of all of the facilities. It should have been a much larger strike.
Well, and we know clearly we had been following and monitoring these facilities. We knew they existed because we knew they could hit them, Bill, and yet we took a long time for us to hit them after the last year's strike.
Yeah, look, I think it was an encouraging step. You know, I remember Saddam Hussein thought he was going to survive shock and awe, and he bet one too many times, and he ended up in a spider hole, dragged out. So we don't know where it's going to go. I would say it's necessary but not sufficient. The two things about Russia that I think are necessary to note is, one, we keep saying, what's Russia's response going to be? That's what the world wants to know, right?
Well, and they denounced the strike, and they said there will be, you will pay a price, but we don't know what that will be.
But let's remember, Russia is there because it was a face-saving out for the Obama administration not to do anything. They were supposed to get rid of these weapons, right? And that's why they're there.
And they did
instead, they got a foothold. So I think that what the president ultimately has to do, we have to change the equation from worrying about what's Putin going to do to people, bad guys out there worrying, what's America going to do?
Well, we have to establish leverage on the ground. If President Trump...
On the ground, on the ground, you mean troops?
No, not necessarily troops, Paul. Okay. There are lots of other things that we can do.
Okay.
But look, if President Trump wants a negotiated settlement to Syria ultimately, they talked again last night about the Geneva process that the UN is running.
That's the peace process and trying to settle the civil war.
Yes, that's correct. Then we can't be afraid of Russia and Iran. One of the things that struck me about General Mattis's comment last night is he was very careful to say we avoided civilian and foreign casualties, and yet they wave their hands around about how Russia is ultimately responsible for these chemical weapons. Then why are we so afraid of Russia? Putin can't afford to lose men and material in Russia. And basically, we also learned last night that our means, our military power is far superior to anything that Russia and Iran are fielding right now in the theater.
Dan, that's the question. The president made in his statement almost a plea to Russia and Iran, saying, is this the kind of behavior you want to be associated with? Their response was, apparently, yes. But are they going to be impressed with this military action, or is it going to be, there's no threat to us, and move on?
I think it's likely that Russia and Iran will step back. There will not be any more use of chemical weapons. They're not going to invite the U.S. and its allies back in. But look, we talk about Syria here. Syria is now basically a protectorate of Iran and Russia.
Right.
They are significantly there. The Israelis are very upset that Iran is starting to establish Syria as a military base to attack Israel. So there is something more that has to come out of this. Now, let's go back to Secretary of Defense Mattis. There was reporting several days ago that the president was upset with him because he was not offering more robust options. And the reason was that General Mattis did not think there was a strategy after the strike.
And I think he's right about that.
Now, recall, President Trump said on Monday there will be a decision on this by the end of the day, as his new national security advisor, John Bolton, was literally walking in the door to take his job. We have got to get to the point where Mr. Bolton, Secretary of State Pompeo, and General Mattis are able to sit down and talk about a strategy going forward. I think this strike gives them the breathing room to do that.
All right, when we come back, President Trump lashing out at James Comey ahead of the former FBI director's book release. So should we expect any bombshells? And how should the White House respond to his coming media tour? Well, as James Comey gets set to kick off his book tour Sunday, President Trump is wasting no time firing back at his former FBI director. Tweeting on Friday, James Comey is a proven leaker and liar. Virtually everyone in Washington thought he should be fired for the terrible job he did until he was, in fact, fired. He leaked classified information for which he should be prosecuted. He lied to Congress under oath. He is a weak and untruthful slimeball who was, as time has proven, a terrible director of the FBI. His handling of the crooked Hillary Clinton case and the events surrounding it will go down as one of the worst botched jobs of history. It was my great honor to fire James Comey. We're back with Dan Henniger and Bill McGurn. So, Bill, first, anything new we learned here from the book about the Comey relationship with Trump?
No, I think we're learning that Director Comey hated Donald Trump as much as Donald Trump seems to hate Director Comey.
Let's take out the seams.
Right. It just seems that, look, Donald Trump doesn't leave a lot of doubt where he stands on his
Yeah, I mean, the slime ball. I mean,
however, the substance of the note, I think, is true. about lying to Congress. You know,
do you think that there's evidence of that?
When he's told Congress, I didn't make my decision on indicting Hillary until after we interviewed Hillary Clinton, and you see he had drafted a statement before. I mean, normal discourse, I don't like to call people liars, but normal discourse, you'd say there's a truth issue there.
But is there anything in here we're learning that could assist the case, say, of Robert Mueller?
I don't know, because I don't think Mr. Comey wants to take responsibility for that. I think he took responsibility for getting Mr. Mueller appointed, but I don't think he wants to say Donald Trump obstructed justice or did anything for the charges. It might actually undermine Mr. Mueller's case.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, there is no smoking gun in this book. If there were, we would have read about it across the top of the New York Times and the Washington Post. All it is a personal complaint about Donald Trump. Nonetheless, James Comey is doing interviews on every media outlet in this country. And, you know, Trump is in a blood war with the mainstream media. We know that. And they are now setting up Mueller as his primary opponent for the moment. And the game is entirely political, Paul. It is to undermine the president, push down on his approval rating, using James Comey as the cat's paw. But there's really not much more there.
There are a lot of unflattering anecdotes in the book. I haven't finished it yet, but I read substantial portions of it. And it really, a lot of the behavior that he says about Trump, you would say that's not presidential.
Right.
You know, they're self-involved and they're nasty.
Right.
It's not like using the word slimeball, for example. But there's nothing that really assists the legal case that we haven't already seen. And Comey himself even says that he can't conclude that firing Comey and remember when he told Comey, Trump told Comey about Michael Flynn, please, you know, see what you can do. That's not the exact phrase, but something like that. He said, I can't conclude that that was obstruction.
Yeah, two things. One is, I think we should say that, you know, a president using the word slimeball is not, you know, not what I would do as a former speechwriter and so forth. However, that said, Mr. Comey's behavior in leaking these memos to a professor that he knows, I think it's equally dishonorable. It's just done in a more
who then leaked them to the press.
Right. It was done, the way he did it's very sneaky. And I think it speaks a lot to what he does. Look, as Dan said, I think the reason it's going to get a good reception is precisely because of these anecdotes. The left's hatred of Donald Trump, and some on the right, is that he's a vulgarian and so forth. And this is going to feed that. So he's useful to the anti-Trump narrative. However, there's a big asterisk here. A lot on the left do not forgive him for his intervention at the end of the campaign. And the Inspector General's report is going to come out soon, all on Hillary stuff, the Hillary investigations. And I think he might be having his moment now. You saw, I mean, Lanny Davis came out with something saying, you know, he should have been fired before. So they're never going to forgive him for that. And so it'll be interesting to see when the IG's report drops what the second reaction to this book is.
He also uses the analogy to the mafia, says Trump wanted mafia loyalty, but don't they have to call it, don't they call it organized crime? There's not enough organized about Trump or this White House to do that. There's certainly not the rule of omerta, because everybody talks about everything all the time.
Well, you know, Loretta Lynch seemed to exercise it pretty well when she ordered him to refer to.
And there was a rule of omerta inside the FBI. Let us say the spectacle of a former FBI director writing a book like that, expressing these sorts of opinions about a president, former, you know, FBI director William Webster, Louis Freeh, they would have gone to their graves before doing something like this in public.
All right, let's finish up with Dan with Michael Cohen, the raid on Trump's office by the special counsels by the Southern District of New York at the request of the special counsel. What does that tell us about the probe?
Well, I think it tells us that the probe, something must be going on here deeper than looking up files on these two porn actresses. I'm very concerned about this, Paul, because I think related to it is the fact that the president has been having such a hard time finding Washington lawyers to represent him. And listen, these are guys who will represent anybody. And so the president, I think, is becoming dangerously isolated as the probe gets tighter and tighter. He's only got 2 or 3 people working for him in Washington. His personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, is now off the table and talking to the prosecutor. I think the president is in a tough spot right now.
It's a big new vulnerability, Bill, isn't it?
It is.
Briefly.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's an outrage that that they did this. Joe DeGenevo was on TV the other night, former U.S. attorney, and he was asked, come on, Joe, didn't you raid lawyers' office sometime? He said, not once, never. It's a big step. And unpopular clients deserve their rights, too. That's one of the lessons of law.
All right, still ahead, House Speaker Paul Ryan announcing his retirement after 20 years in Congress. Karl Rove on his legacy and the potential midterm election fallout next.
I will be retiring in January, leaving this majority in good hands with what I believe is a very bright future. One of my conditions was that we aim high, that we do big things, that we fashion an agenda, that we run on that agenda, that we win an election, and then we execute that agenda. I am so proud that that is exactly what we have done and what we are doing right now.
House Speaker Paul Ryan announced this week that he won't seek re-election in November and will leave Congress in January after 20 years. I spoke to Wall Street Journal columnist and former Bush advisor Karl Rove earlier about what Ryan's retirement means for the GOP. Karl Rove, welcome. Paul Ryan saying he's not going to run for re-election. You said it was this week that it was a blow to Republicans. Why?
Well, first of all, because of his leadership. I mean, he came into a fractious caucus and was the one person with the moral authority to unite all the wings and all the disparate groups of the party and make them move raggedly together in the House. Second of all, he's a man of tremendous principle who has helped the Republican Party embrace pro-growth economic policies, whether it be tax reform or trade or regulatory relief. And what he did as the Budget Committee chairman to educate his fellow Republicans as to the necessity of entitlement reform and then helping them come to grips with how they could explain it to the American people was extraordinary leadership and will be sorely missed.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think you have to say tax reform, big victory, enormous success. But on the budget stuff, they didn't get entitlement reform done. He got it through the House on Medicaid and got it through the House on Obamacare, but he couldn't get it through Congress. So that's a failure on the chalkboard.
Well, but you know what? I wouldn't attribute the failure of the Senate to pass it to Paul Ryan's responsibility. He's the leader of the House. I'm sorry the Republicans in the Senate didn't take it up. We always knew that it was going to be difficult to get it done there. But they got it through the House, and that was his principal responsibility. And the pressure will be on in the years ahead. We're going to look back, in my opinion, 10 years from now and find that we have made reforms and entitlements in this country that spring from the work that Paul Ryan patiently did on the Budget Committee and the Ways and Means Committee and as Speaker. And you got to start somewhere. And he got a lot more progress than I would have anticipated by getting the House rallied behind it and get it through the House and onto the Senate.
Okay, I want to talk about his dealings with Donald Trump, because, you know, Ryan kind of gets it from both sides. On the one hand, some on the right say, you know, you criticized Trump too much, you weren't helpful enough. People on the left say, look, you should have denounced Trump, you should have said that he's unfit to be president and not worked with him. How do you think he handled Trump?
Well, I think he handled him well because he was the leader of the House Republicans. He was elected on the same ticket with Trump. He had a responsibility as a party leader to help the sitting president. But on the other hand, he was true to his principles. And I thought it was good for the country and good for the party and, frankly, good for President Trump to have Paul Ryan speaking his mind in a candid, thoughtful and respectful way when he did disagree with the president. For example, in the days after Charlottesville, I think the president terribly mishandled that issue, but I thought Paul Ryan helped set him in the right course, and we began to see some of the things that Paul was saying and the tone that he was adopting to be reflected in some of the comments from the White House. But look, there's always a tension between the responsibilities of a party leader in the Senate or the House leadership and the relationship they have with the president. And I think Paul, given a difficult situation, handled it well.
There's a lot of commentary, particularly from the left, that Paul Ryan, the Paul Ryan party, political party, Republican Party, is now dead with his departure. It's now Donald Trump's party. So the growth wing, the Jack Kemp wing, the Reagan wing of the party, the inclusive wing is now dead. How do you respond to that?
I think that's wishful thinking. I think that's the left saying what it wants to have happen, not what is really happening. Look, Paul set an example. He helped not only draw into politics a lot of new young people who are who share his aspirations for the kind of Republican Party that he wants, but also help persuade some of his colleagues of long standing that they had to help take these timeless principles of conservatism and apply them to the challenges the country faces in a confident and optimistic way. And we wouldn't have gotten tax reform had we not had that kind of leadership, because he was asking, and with Kevin Brady, the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, they were asking their colleagues to do difficult things and to go home and explain them. And they did. And good for them in doing that. But no, I think that's wishful thinking.
Okay.
As is the idea that we've seen the last of Paul Ryan. I don't think we have.
All right. Well, let's talk about the midterms, which are coming up. Paul Ryan says he's going to stay as Speaker. Some backbenchers saying, no, he should leave early. I don't think that's going to happen. But what do you think his departure means to the Republican Party in the midterms? He's a big money raiser. I guess he can still do that, but not maybe with as strong a perch.
Yeah, no, not as effective, which is why, look, I think I hear the thought we ought to, him having made the decision that he's not running for re-election, let's have the leadership battle right now, get it settled, have clarity, and move forward. But that leaves us with one new person as Speaker rallying support for the fall. I'd rather have what we look like we're going to have, which is Paul Ryan as Speaker, still able to go out there and ask people for money and support for our candidates, but also at least one, if not two, contenders in the form of Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise for his replacement. Let them now go show what they can do. Let them show their chops. What can they do to help their colleagues win re-election? How can they rally financial support, political support, enthusiasm, and message discipline that will help our candidates win? I'd rather have three people, right. Ryan, McCarthy, and Scalise, than just one.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Karl Rove. Appreciate it.
You bet. Thank you, Paul.
Still ahead, Paul Ryan's retirement setting off a scramble to replace him as Speaker. Who Ryan thinks is the man for the job and whether his fellow Republicans will agree. Next.
I've seen it all. I've seen politics and government from the inside, and I can see what's wrong with it and what's broken and what needs to be changed.
Wherever I smell hypocrisy, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, I will go after them.
We don't have time to dance around the issue. I like to get right to the point. I just come at the news with a different viewpoint.
My job is getting to the bottom line of what is the American people's truth.
Which is achieved. And I believe its future is bright. The economy is strong. We've given Americans greater confidence in their lives. And I have every confidence that I'll be handing this gavel on to the next Republican Speaker of the House next year.
House Speaker Paul Ryan touting the accomplishments of the Republican conference during his tenure and voicing optimism that he'll hand the gavel to another Republican when he retires in January. We're back with Dan Henninger, Bill McGurn, and Wall Street Journal editorial page writer Kate Batchelder Odell. So, Kate, you've been following the Republican conference. What do you think Ryan's retirement means for their ability to govern?
I'm not sure it's a positive sign. I mean, if you remember how we got into the Ryan speakership in the first place, it was because Kevin McCarthy, who would now like to be Speaker, dropped out because he was not able to command a majority. And the reason for that is because the House Freedom Caucus was peeling off 30 or 40 votes. I mean, we wrote at the time in an editorial called The Republican Crack-Up that the Freedom Caucus might be able to deny McCarthy or anybody a majority and give the Democrats more leverage, which ultimately is the story.
So Ryan was the only one willing to take the job and was able to govern for the most part. I think, Bill, he leaves a big hole in the growth wing of the party. I mean, he's been the real spokesman for it. Tax reform wouldn't have happened without him.
Yeah. And he delivered on the health care even if the Senate didn't. Look, I think he had the best qualification for a job in Washington. He didn't want it, right? He took it out of obligation. He did a good job. And look, people, one of the criticisms of Paul Ryan is he's become a Trumpian Republican. I think the reverse is really true. To the degree that Donald Trump has had big successes, it's more because of when he's adopted Ryan-esque type programs, not just the tax cuts, but the deregulation and so forth, and a growth-oriented thing. That came from more traditional Republican sources, primarily
military spending, for example, some other things.
So what about a lot of Ryanism in there?
What about the entitlement reform failure, Kate? Though that was
Sure, I mean, that's disappointing, and it always looks like the window on entitlement reform is closing, and it was disappointing.
When did it open? That's what I'd like to know.
You know, the failure on Medicaid, ultimately not Paul Ryan's fault, but still disappointing because that's supposed to be one of the more straightforward entitlements compared to Social Security and Medicare. And the House is going to consider some modest change to food stamps this year that even those look remote, right? So it is.
That might pass the House, but probably not the Senate.
Right.
Again.
It's disappointing, but I agree with Carl that these ideas sometimes take a long time, and Paul Ryan has left a lot of a roadmap on how to do it if we can get somebody else.
What about this critique that Ryan was not critical enough of Trump, should have really been a lot more screaming about the attack on norms and democracy and so on?
I think that misreads his role as Speaker. He's trying to lead the Republican caucus. These are people who represent their own districts. It was already a fractious group when he took it over. And I think it's truer to say, as Congressman Peter King said a few days ago, they're going to miss Paul Ryan because he was the one who held them together. I mean, it's kind of bad news and good news here. The bad news is they could fall on each other with long knives and just carve up the Republican caucus.
Oh, and I'm confident that many will try.
The good news is we've already had the bad. That was last year when the Freedom Caucus and the rest of them started to do that. It's possible, Paul, that a lot of them have learned their lesson because they are staring down the barrel of House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. And the question is, A, do they want that, or how bad do they want it to be next year?
Well, doesn't also, if you're elected as Speaker of the House and you just have a president, don't you have an obligation to actually try to accomplish something for the country?
Look,
I mean, no, I'm serious point. I mean, what are you going to do? Stand up and say, I refuse to work with this man because I don't like everything he says? He can't do that.
That's what a lot of people will never forgive him for. Look, there's two parts of the conservative wing of the Republican Party that dislikes Ryan. Some people crazily think he's a rhino. You have to make compromises when you're Speaker. The other half will never forgive him for not torching Donald Trump. And I saw this at a meeting at the Republican convention when people were asking him, why don't you denounce Trump? And Trump was behind then. He said, look, the House is going to be the only check on President Nancy Pelosi. And I think he behaved very honorably, but a lot of people will never forgive him for that.
Yeah, all right. So who is the favorite, Kate, in the run for Speaker?
Right now it is Kevin McCarthy. He wants another shot at it, and he did step aside in 2015 instead of doubling down on what would have ultimately become a bloody fight. We are hearing that there might be a challenge from Jim Jordan, who is the well-known Freedom Caucus member.
From Ohio.
From Ohio, and I don't think anybody thinks he could command 218 votes, but he deserves a shot at it if he wants the job, and why not?
By all means, let's go for it. Show. I mean, I'm more power to him if he does stand. I think if these guys think he can command a majority for their point of view and for that leadership, I think they ought to have it out. But then if you have whoever loses basically has to say we're going to follow
exactly. That's what I mean about having some optimism here. They have been through that crucible before where they were completely in the opposition. Now there's an opportunity in the battle with Kevin McCarthy to show that they can act in a constructive way. There's going to be an argument, no question about it. But the question, will it be to destroy the Republican caucus or allow it to survive the post-Ryan era?
All right, when we come back, the political fallout after last night's strike on Syria, how it might affect how we move forward in Congress. Stay tuned. After last night's strike in Syria, President Trump is dealing with the political fallout of his decision to further U.S. involvement in Syria after 7 long years of civil war. And while some are applauding him for his restrained and targeted response to Assad's use of chemical weapons, others are saying that he should not be able to make that decision unilaterally, with former vice presidential candidate and Virginia Senator Tim Kaine tweeting Trump's decision to launch airstrikes against Syria without Congress's approval is illegal. We need to stop giving presidents a blank check to wage war. Today it's Syria, but what's going to stop him from bombing Iran or North Korea next? We're back with Dan Henninger, Mary Kissel, and Bill McGurn. So, Mary, step back a bit before we get into Kaine. What's the general response been politically?
Well, remember, it was a Democrat who wanted to enforce the red line in Syria first. That was President Obama. So I think generally speaking, on both sides of the aisle, there's an acceptance that this was the right thing to do and that President Trump's last strike wasn't enough of a deterrent and that this strike was proportionate to that. So I think broadly speaking, there's support. I think he'd have more support if it was part of a larger strategy about how to approach Syria in the context of the broader Middle East.
And yet Chuck Schumer said, I support the response because of the use of chemical weapons. This is the Democratic leader in the Senate, but hey, don't get us involved in anything over there. I mean, so how much support would he really have by Democrats in particular if he did do the kind of strategy we're talking about?
I think Democrats are always looking for a campaign issue. You've got the midterm elections coming up. Often it's not about the broader national security interest of the United States. It's more about political power. Sorry if that sounds too cynical, Paul.
What about the Republicans, Dan? Rand Paul, of course, agrees with Tim Kaine, but generally speaking, they tend to be supportive.
Tend to be. In the Congress, I think it's been pretty full support other than Rand Paul. They're behind the president on this. The big question, though, is whether he has that kind of unified support out there in the Trump base. I mean, there are a lot of populists, and they do have the representatives in the media who think we should not be involved, that this violates Trump's America First dictum, and that we should pull the troops home, as he said he was going to do about a week ago. That's what they want. And the question is, how many of those people, we know there are spokesmen out there who are saying that, but how many people on the ground in the Trump electorate are going to be upset at this strike? My guess, Paul, is that not that many, that most of the people, Trumpians out there, would support a president taking action.
But there's an awful vocal group of people on talk radio and elsewhere and Twitter who are already denouncing Trump. These are his supposed supporters for even this action because they're saying, you promised us to come home.
I think there's a difference, as Dan was saying, between, say, talk radio, people like us, editorial boards and stuff, and the average Trump voter or the average American voter. Most Americans like shows of strength, especially if it looks like it's going to work. It's when it doesn't look like it. Trump is caught. There's a reason that there is no larger rationale. He campaigned against involvement in Bush-like long wars. He campaigned very strongly on that. So the people that criticize him they have a case. And he also campaigned against Obama-like weakness, which gave us ISIS. So he's trying to thread that needle. These one-off attacks are a way of doing it. It's probably not going to be satisfactory, but I think so. I think the American people are going to be very much behind it.
Well, then, and if you want to do that, a larger strategy we talked about earlier in the program of a safe zone of some kind, Mary, it's this kind of thing that you can do. You don't need to have an Iraq-like policy. I mean, this was done by the first President Bush with air power in Iraq, the northern part of Iraq. But it would take those kinds of air sorties, and it would be, it's a strategy you'd have to sell to the American people. And I don't know the president really wants to do that.
Well, President Trump has already sold an Iran strategy, recall last year, where he said he wanted to contain Iran's ambitions.
Excellent point.
Syria fits directly into that.
Iran's ambitions.
Correct. That wasn't mentioned last night. President Trump also defined the mission as defeating ISIS and al-Qaeda groups in Syria. Well, guess what? If Assad or son of Assad stays in Syria, you're going to have terrorism there because the terror threat is in response to Assad. So some big issues for the national security.
I don't remember a lot of Democrats saying, President Obama, you must come to Congress for permission to do your bombing runs in Syria.
And more than that, one of the false choices that President Obama gave us was that there was nothing we could do between a full-scale invasion of Syria and washing our hands. Look, there's a lot of ways to do a safe zone. You could have Arab armies enforce it and so forth. We support the air power, have some people training people. We don't have to have an Iraq kind of invasion. There's a lot of paths.
Briefly, Dan, do you think Congress should get into this?
No, not at all. Nancy Pelosi wants them to send the strategy up so they can approve it. 535 commanders-in-chief usually doesn't work.
All right. Thank you all. We have to take one more break when we come back. Hits and misses of the week.